Well, welcome to session 1. I'm glad you're here joining me. Chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of a chunk that not many people have read all the way. We begin to look at it and then our eyes roll back in our head thinking, oh my word, what does a bunch of names who Jesus was related to have anything to do with me and my faith? Well, it has a lot to do with it. Now, the first thing we need to understand is that the Gospel of Matthew, the audience was a Jewish audience, Jewish Christians. Now, just in the same way you would write a letter or email differently to grandma than you would to one of your BFFs across town, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have different audiences, and therefore each one is written differently. Okay, why are there differences in the Gospels? Why are there differences of accounts? Well, one easy way, and you've probably heard this before, is imagine an event happening, a car crash happening at an intersection. Imagine 4 people, one standing on each corner of the intersection. Each would describe it a different way, even though it's the same event. Now that's kind of the way it is with the Gospels. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John describing the same thing, but from different perspectives. They saw different things, they heard different things. They were with Jesus for 3 years, who didn't recreate new material every time he said something. He had pretty much the same thing that he said over and over again, and that maybe is why there's some differences in the thing. Now, what we're looking at here is Matthew. I want you to remember this. You can see Matthew is written probably to a Jewish audience in Syria, okay, which is up north of Palestine there. Matthew isn't the first of the Gospels. Mark more than likely is. Now, it being said that it's a Jewish audienced gospel, Matthew takes great care to give Jewish genealogy. If you look back in, say, the Old Testament, the early Old Testament, you will see, especially in Genesis, in those earlier books, genealogies happening very often. And in those cases, they are used as markers and dividers in books. In this case, it's used to set Jesus up as the Messiah. And so it's very important that we see these not as boring old names that we can skip over, but as something very important. So, we're going to read these together. I'm going to read to you from the Kingdom New Testament here, the genealogy of Jesus, Matthew 1 through 17. So you get your Bible and follow along, or just listen, but I would encourage you to get your own Bible. The book of the family tree of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. You hear that? Jewish clues. Just something to think about. Abraham became the father of Isaac, Isaac of Jacob, Jacob of Judah and his brothers, Judah of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, Perez of Esrom, Esrom of Aram, Aram of Abinadab, Abinadab of Nason, Nason of Solomon, Solomon of Boaz by Rahab, Boaz of Obed by Ruth, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David the king. David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, Solomon of Rehoboam, Rehoboam of Abijah, Abijah of Asaph, Asaph of Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat of Joram, Joram of Uzziah, Uzziah of Jotham, Jotham of Ahaz, Ahaz of Hezekiah, Hezekiah of Manasseh, Manasseh of Amoz, Amoz of Josiah, Josiah of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the exile in Babylon. After the Babylonian exile, Jeconiah became the father of Salathiel, Salathiel of Zerubbabel, Zerubbabel of Abiud, Abiud of Eliakim, Eliakim of Azor, Azor of Sadok, Sadok of Akim, Akim of Eliud, Eliud of Eleazar, Eleazar of Methan, Methan of Jacob, and Jacob of Joseph, the husband of Mary, from whom was born Jesus, who is called Messiah. So all the generations from Abraham to David add up to 14. From David to the Babylonian exile, 14 generations. And from the Babylonian exile to the Messiah, 14 generations. That's a lot of names, right? A lot of names that you really don't care about and understand or can even hardly pronounce. Well, that's okay, because we really need to look at this here just for a second. We need to understand what this is saying. So this is like a parade, with the parade growing in importance. We're waiting to see who comes at the end. The front of the parade, okay, the front of the parade's great, right? It opens up with Abraham. Abraham there is, of course, the father of the Jews, right? Abraham, Genesis chapter 12. The first guy we get to know. Abraham is where it all started. God says to Abram at the time, before he changed his name to Abraham, he says to Abram, through you, all the nations of the world are going to be blessed. And you're going to have a family as great as the stars in the sky. Right there. Right there. Through Abraham, in verse 1 and 2, all the way down to Jesus, who blesses the whole world. So it's a fulfillment of that. It's a fulfillment of the promise, okay? So in this long line of parade growing people, we have it coming to this glorious climax. You want to call it the Grand Master of the parade, sitting in the red convertible, waving to people with the sash and the top hat, is Jesus, the Messiah. It's a building of this. Boy, it's a building of the promises. Now, maybe you've done that like 23andMe stuff where you do the swab or the spit and you get to find out who you were, because in that genealogy, in that genetics, we like to see who we are, where we've been, and what our family might have been. The same is true here. The same is true for Jesus in Matthew chapter 1. It sets up, out of this glorious parade of very famous names, who Jesus really is. I said to you, he's the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham, which every Jew would have been like, yeah, Abraham. You see Abraham showing up all the way through these Gospels. Jesus as the fulfillment of this promise. Remember, these were good Jewish Christians who knew all of this by heart, that Matthew was writing to, right? They grew up in learning Torah and memorizing the Bible, which is our Old Testament. They knew it much more than you and I do. They could recite it. They actually took time at it. Go figure. Maybe we should too. Anyway, let's go through here and look at this, okay? Let's go through and see just who shows up in here. This is really amazing, because this tells us who Jesus is. I've already given you the Abraham part, and I encourage you not to skip over this, because any first century Jew who was reading this gospel or hearing it would be impressed, super impressed, and I need you to hear this, to start understanding this. Who it was. It wasn't written to us, but it was written for us. Okay, so we need to understand who it was written to before we can understand what it's for. So here we go. Here is the great honor line. This is Israel's ancestry. Okay, so we have Jesus here claiming to be, Matthew claiming that Jesus is of the line of Abraham, the first Hebrew, the first Jew, the first person, covenant of God. Other than the old stories, the primeval stories, Adam and Eve, all the Noah, Tower of Babel. Abraham's our very first one, and his family goes into exile, or goes into slavery in Egypt to promised land to exile in Babylon, come back, and now to Jesus. According to our author, N.T. Wright here, in the time of Jesus, very few people would be able to trace their lineage back to the kings, David and Solomon, especially all of that. Okay, very few people would, because of all of the turmoil that had happened. Because back in the 400s BC, if you'll remember, King Nebuchadnezzar came with his army and laid siege to Jerusalem, wiped everybody out. It was a disgusting siege. Took people off to Babylon in exile. 80 years later, they were returned by King Cyrus, not of Babylonian descent, Persian, if memory serves. Anyway, very few people could trace their lineage, according to N.T. Wright, back to David and especially Solomon and those afterwards. Well, let's line out the history here so that you can remember. These are huge events. We have Abraham way back in the misty era of time, right? Maybe 1600 BC. We have the years of slavery. And you can find like Ramses II, who they have his mummy, and right. And I always find it interesting to look at the Ramses II mummy because I think those eyes saw Moses. Fascinating. I mean, blows my mind. Anyway, so Moses leads Israel, the 10 plagues, leads Israel out of slavery through the Red Sea to Mount Sinai, where they are given the 10 Commandments and the covenant, right? Then they go on. They wander through the desert for 40 years, at which time they come across the Jordan to the Promised Land with Joshua. We have the conquest. Okay, so these are huge events in Jewish life, which you see all the way through the Old Testament, and no Jew ever forgets these, even contemporary Jews. So they take the Promised Land. They live in the Promised Land. Yay! We come to King David, who is the epitome, right? The beautiful king, the conquest king, the God's own heart. But then he screws up with having sex with Bathsheba. Oh, whoops, wrong book. Ha! Then he screws up having sex with Bathsheba, and they have an illegitimate child, a child of sin, Solomon. Did you hear that in there? Anyway, we go through Solomon down through there until King of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, comes and destroys in 400s BC. And then they come back 80 years later. And since that time, Israel didn't really have a functioning monarchy because, as you will recall, they got through there and Alexander the Great had marched through and taken them all over, that entire area. And after him, he gave it after he died, to these generals, 5 generals who split up the territory. Israel won independence from them with with battles and revolts you find in the Maccabees, the books that aren't in Protestant Bibles. And then after that, they have 100 years of peace. And then in 65 BC, we see the Romans come marching through. The Romans come marching through. They take over everything. And that leads us up to today. Jesus, the Promised Land, still occupied by enemy forces, pagan forces. Okay? Now remember those pieces. Those are very important. So as we come through here, we see that Herod is the king of the Jews. Now Herod, old King Herod, not new Herod, old King Herod, he wasn't even fully Jewish. He was just like an opportunistic military commander that Rome put in so they could kind of like work him, and you know, he was just kind of a puppet. He was crazy. He went on a building spree. He started the second temple, right? The beautiful temple there that was completed during the Jesus era. Beautiful temple, and lots of other beautiful things. The temple was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. But Herod wasn't even a Jew. And the true Jews were wondering when God would act, when God would come and save them. When would God come and rescue us? That's the answer here. Now Jesus here is claiming to be of royal true royal lineage. Now, Jesus, of course, isn't Matthew's writing it, but Jesus is. Now, imagine you're in that time, and we've talked about Herod. Herod, who later on we'll see killing babies 2 years and under, really ugly fellow. Imagine if his spies heard you claiming that you were of the descendants of the true kings of Israel. Do you suppose that's a very healthy thing to do? Not really. You might end up on the pointy business end of a sword. But Matthew is claiming that for Jesus here. Now, Jesus is the goal of this whole list. The whole list. Now, what we need to know here is a little more Jewish culture. 7 was a very important number for the Jews. 7 was a perfect number, right? As was 3, but 7 was perfect. And if you'll notice here, there are chunks of names. So Matthew divides it up into 3 chunks of 14, but if you'll notice, we can also divide that into 6 chunks of 7 names. And so Jesus is the first of the 7th. So he is number 1 in the perfect 7. So in that way, he is the fulfillment, the Jubilee, the perfect, remember, Sabbath day. 6 days God did, and on the 7th day, God enjoyed his reign. That's what resting means. Enjoyed the peace of his reign, his perfection. The Sabbath. The Sabbath, the 7 days in all of Israel through the covenant, the commandments. Jesus is the first in the 7th chunk. Jesus is the climax of this. Some other things of note in this long list is that there is Tamar in there. She was treated as a prostitute by Judah, her father-in-law. So in Jesus' lineage, there is a woman who's treated as a prostitute. Not very pleasant. We have Boaz. Boaz is the son of the Jericho prostitute Rahab. And David, as I mentioned earlier, committing adultery with Bathsheba, producing a son, and then killing his father, Uriah the Hittite. So we have these 3 really awkward names in here. So we see God using fallible people for God's good, for his glory. We see people who really were maybe unsavory, made really bad choices, or sinful in David's case. God using these still to bring about good from Jesus. So this is, of course, meaning for you and I that sometimes when we make bad choices, ugly choices, sinful choices, God can still use that for his good. Okay, so to sum this up then, we can say that the reason Matthew puts this here, this large chunk of genealogy, is to make 2 distinct, very powerful claims. First is that Jesus is the fulfillment of millennia of promises, okay, to the Jewish people whom he covenanted with to change the world. The promises of God stand, and they still stand today. Okay, so we have that fulfillment. But we also have this idea that Jesus is something very different. He is the fulfillment, but he is also the future. So it's this both and. Jesus is this beautiful pinnacle, this peak of history. And Matthew helps us understand that. He helps good Jews understand who Jesus is. Jesus is thoroughly 100% Jewish. We've got to remember that. That'll help us understand this as we continue on in our study of Matthew. So here again, to sum it up, the story of Israel is told in this genealogy. Abraham, released from slavery, the Exodus, the Promised Land, and the great kings, David, Solomon, the kingship through the exile to Babylon and back again. And of course, the weird inclusion, the interesting inclusion of unsavory characters that shows how God uses broken, fallible people to accomplish really great things. And that sets us up for the next section where Jesus is Mary. We get to the Mary part, okay, where Mary is pregnant with this Jesus, not by Joseph, but through the power of the Holy Spirit. Well, that's that. So if you have any thoughts or comments, write them below. All right. See you next time.